Hey there, to all our listeners out there who just love to think, To all you philosophy fans, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah, we're really excited for this one.
Today we're going way back to the 13th century.
That's right.
We're going to be looking at medieval logic, which I know might sound a little dry at first.
Right.
But trust me, we're focusing on a thinker who was grappling with some pretty fundamental questions about, like, the nature of thought and how we communicate.
Yeah, and these are really important ideas, even today, for anyone interested in philosophy.
For sure. So we're going deep into the work of William of Sherwood.
William of Sherwood.
He was an English logician who taught at the University of Paris.
One of the major centers of learning in the medieval world.
Absolutely. And his textbook, Introduction to Logic, it wasn't just like any old textbook.
No, not at all.
It was actually one of the four most influential logic textbooks of its time.
Huge impact.
Yeah. Really shaped how people thought about logic for centuries.
And he was recognized as a brilliant mind by his peers.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Roger Bacon, who was no slouch himself, called Sherwood, get this, much wiser than Albert the Great.
Wow.
When it came to Philosophia Communis, the core, like the heart of philosophical understanding.
Okay, so we're talking about somebody who was like really respected, really sharp.
Absolutely.
So to guide us through Sherwood's ideas, we're mainly relying on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yeah, the entry on William of Sherwood, it's a really great resource. It brings together all the latest research, so we can be sure we're getting, an accurate and up-to-date picture.
And that's what we're aiming for in this deep dive. We want to give you the most fascinating, the most relevant bits of Sherwood's work, particularly the stuff that we think will resonate with you, our philosophy-loving listeners.
Yeah, we want to highlight what makes him unique, how he stands out, and see how his ideas connect to those big philosophical questions that never really go away.
Exactly. So to start off, let's get a sense of who Sherwood was and the world he lived in.
Okay, so Sherwood, he was probably born in Nottinghamshire, England, sometime between 1200 and 1205.
Okay, so right at the beginning of the 13th century.
Yeah, and he died, we think, between 1266 and 1272. So he lived a pretty good lifespan for the time.
Right.
Now, we know he spent a significant part of his career teaching logic at the University of Paris, probably from around 1235 to 1250.
So that's like the peak of his career.
Yeah, and later on, he also held positions at Oxford and within the church.
Okay, so a pretty accomplished guy.
Very much so.
It seems like, though, figuring out his life story has been a bit tricky for historians.
Yeah, well, you see, there were quite a few prominent Englishmen named William back in the 13th century, and even more than one William Sherwood.
Ah, I see.
So it's been difficult to be absolutely sure which writings belong to our William of Sherwood.
Mm-hmm.
But we can confidently say that the Introduction to Logic and a treatise on Syncategoremata are definitely his.
Okay, and what are Syncategoremata?
They're those little words in a sentence that don't have meaning on their own, but they change the meaning of other words, like every some or not. Really important for understanding how language works.
Gotcha. So, Sherwood was really interested in the nitty-gritty of language.
He was. And to really appreciate his contributions, we got to understand the intellectual climate of his time.
Okay.
So picture this. It's the 12th century. There's this huge influx of newly translated works by Aristotle. By Sherwood's time, these Aristotelian texts, they're like the hottest thing in university education.
Everyone's reading Aristotle.
Exactly. And this is largely thanks to scholars like John LePage, who really pushed for Aristotle to be part of the curriculum.
Okay.
And this is where we see the rise of terminus logic. It was a new approach, going beyond just commenting on Aristotle and really digging into the properties of terms and those syncategorematic words we talked about.
So Sherwood was a terminus logician.
He was one of the most important.
I see.
So instead of just accepting Aristotle as the final word, terminus logicians like Sherwood were like, okay, let's take these tools Aristotle gave us and let's sharpen them, let's refine them, let's see what else we can do with them.
I like that. They're taking the tools and innovating.
Exactly. And Sherwood was a master innovator.
So let's get into the specifics of his thought, his semantic theory, which is like his theory of meaning.
Right.
The source highlights four main properties of terms that Sherwood identified: signification, supposition, copulation, and appellation.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is that his way of categorizing these properties it was different from what other logicians at the time were doing. He was forging his own path.
Okay, so break it down for us. What did he mean by each of these four properties, and why was it such a big deal that he had his own way of classifying them?
All right. So, signification, he defined as a presentation of the form of something to the understanding. Basically, it's about how a word or a term brings to mind a concept in your head. Now, this idea, it wasn't totally new. It kind of echoed those earlier semantic theories from the 12th century, the ones that we're really concerned with, like the connection between words and concepts.
Okay.
Now, supposition and copulation, he saw these as kind of mirror images of each other. Supposition, he said, is an ordering of the understanding of something under something else.
Okay.
And copulation is, get this, an ordering of the understanding of something over something else. So they're both about how our minds connect different concepts, but in opposite directions, sort of.
I see. And can any word have these properties, supposition and copulation?
Not exactly. He was very specific about that.
Okay.
He said only substantive nouns, pronouns, and definite descriptions can have supposition.
All right.
Whereas adjectives, participles, and verbs, those are the ones that can have copulation.
Interesting. So he's really creating a system here, a logical grammar, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He's trying to map out the structure of language and how it reflects the structure of thought.
Right. And then there's appellation. What's that about?
Appellation. He defined it as the present correct application of a term. Or, to put it another way, the property with respect to which what the term signifies can be said of something through the use of the verb is.
Could you maybe give an example?
Sure. So, let's say we have the term human. The appellata of human would be all the existing humans in the world right now. It's about the things that the term can truthfully be applied to at a specific point in time.
I see. So it's about, the real-world reference of a term.
Exactly. And he saw appellation as kind of a bridge between supposition and copulation.
Okay.
Substantive nouns, adjectives, and participles, those can have appellation, but pronouns and verbs can't.
Right. So we have these four properties, and it seems like supposition is a pretty central one.
It is. And the source then points to a very specific type of supposition that Sherwood came up with, manerial supposition.
Ah, yes, manerial supposition.
Which, it doesn't seem like later logicians really picked up on. What was Sherwood getting at with this idea, and why do you think it didn't catch on?
Well, manerial supposition, it's where things get really interesting, especially if you're into, the classic philosophical debate about universals.
Okay, remind us what that debate is about.
Right, so the problem of universals, it's about whether these general concepts, like humanity or redness or justice, whether they exist as real entities out there in the world, or if they're just mental constructs, ways we group things together in our minds.
Gotcha. So how does manerial supposition fit into this?
So Sherwood says that manerial supposition is a type of simple supposition. Remember, simple supposition is when a term stands for its universal meaning, not for any particular instance.
Right. Like in the example, man is a species, where man refers to the concept of humanity, not to any specific person.
Exactly. And Sherwood's point is that in manerial supposition, a word can stand for its universal meaning without any connection with things.
Okay, so how does that work? How can a word refer to something that doesn't exist in the real world?
Well, this is where we got to delve into how people in the 12th century were thinking about these things. So the word manneries, it meant things like character, way, mode, or manner.
Okay.
And this connected to earlier debates about the nature of universals.
Like how?
So you have someone like John of Salisbury talked about how Jocelyn, who was the Bishop of Soissons, made a distinction between understanding a genus or a species as a real universal thing and understanding it as a mode or a manneries of things.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Well, it's subtle. But basically, it's like saying that you can think about humanity as this abstract thing that exists in itself, or you could think about it as a way that individual humans exist. It's like a property or a quality that they share rather than a separate thing.
I think I'm starting to see.
And this kind of thinking, it goes even further back to Abelard and his work on fallacies, specifically the fallacy parvipantane. And Sherwood, he seems to be drawing on this whole tradition. He's saying that, look, general terms, they can refer directly to their universal meanings, even if those meanings aren't tied to any specific things that exist in the world.
So he's a realist then. He thinks universals are real.
He's definitely working within the realist tradition. But what's interesting about manerial supposition is that it offers this, different way of thinking about how realists could talk about universals. It's not just that universals exist as separate things, it's that they exist as these like ways of being, these manneries that individual things can share.
That's fascinating. It's like a more nuanced way of being a realist.
Exactly. Now, as for why manerial supposition didn't really catch on with later logicians, well, there could be a few reasons.
Like what?
Maybe they found it too subtle, or maybe the way they were thinking about universals was shifting. We'll get to that later when we talk about Occam.
Okay, looking forward to that. But first, I want to know what Sherwood had to say about singular terms like proper names. Those seem pretty straightforward.
Yeah, you'd think so. But Sherwood's take on singular terms is actually pretty interesting.
How so?
Well, a lot of logicians back then, they either didn't really talk about singular terms in their theories of supposition, or they just said, nope, singular terms, they're not part of this. But Sherwood, he recognized that they could have both simple and personal supposition.
Okay, remind me, what's personal supposition again?
Personal supposition is when a term directly refers to the thing it names. Like if I say Socrates, and I'm talking about the actual historical Socrates, that's personal supposition.
Okay, and simple supposition.
Right. That's when a term refers to its universal meaning, like in man as a species.
Right.
So Sherwood's saying that even a singular term like Socrates, it can do both. It can refer to the actual Socrates, and it can also stand for the universal concept of humanity, depending on the context.
Wow. So he's giving singular terms more, like flexibility, more semantic depth.
Exactly. He's recognizing that even though they seem simple, singular terms can actually play different roles in language. He was ahead of his time in that way.
Okay. So we've talked about the properties of terms. What about whole statements? How did Sherwood understand those?
All right. Well, Sherwood had this interesting way of looking at statements, especially universal affirmative statements.
What are those again?
Universal affirmative statements are like all dogs are mammals or every human is mortal. They're statements that say something is true of an entire category or class of things.
Gotcha.
Now, Sherwood, he made this distinction between principal and secondary parts of a statement.
Okay.
The principal parts are like the main building blocks, the nouns and the verbs. They're what the statement is really about.
Okay, I see.
And the secondary parts, well, they're like the supporting characters. They're adjectival names, adverbs, conjunctions, prepositions.
Right. So they're not the main focus, but they're important for modifying the meaning.
Yeah, exactly. And he pointed out something really important about these secondary parts, these syncategorematic words.
Right. Those little words that don't mean anything on their own.
He said they don't have independent signification. They only gain meaning when they're connected to the principal parts, the nouns and verbs. Think about words like every, some, if, or not. They don't refer to anything specific in the world, but they can totally change the meaning of a sentence.
Right. Like all humans are mortal is a very different statement from some humans are mortal.
Exactly. And this is where Sherwood and his English buddy, Roger Bacon, they took a distinctively English approach to these syncategorematic terms, especially distributive terms like every or all.
Okay, so what was so distinctively English about their approach?
Well, Sherwood and Bacon, they considered these distributive terms to be syncategorematic, just like the other secondary parts.
Yeah.
But some continental logicians, like John LePage and Peter of Spain, they usually talked about these terms in the context of distribution, which wasn't as big of a deal in English logic at the time.
So it's like a slightly different way of categorizing these terms based on their role in the sentence.
Precisely.
So how did Sherwood deal with these distributive terms specifically? The source mentioned his rule 2 for every or all.
Right. So Sherwood, he had this rule that said, for a statement with every or all to be true, there have to be at least 3 things that the subject term applies to.
At least 3.
Yeah. So if I say all humans are mortal, for that to be true, there got to be at least 3 humans in existence.
Okay, why 3?
He got this idea from Aristotle, actually. Aristotle said, of 2 men, we say that they are 2 or both, and not that they are all.
So it's about using the right quantifier for the number of things you're talking about.
Exactly. You wouldn't say all if you're only talking about 2 things.
Makes sense.
So Sherwood's rule, it's connecting the logic of every and all to the actual number of things in the world.
That's interesting. It's like a more grounded approach to universal statements.
It is. And this kind of thinking is going to become important later when we talk about intuitionistic logic and how it differs from classical logic.
Okay. Looking forward to that. Now, the source also mentions something pretty surprising. It says Sherwood was the first logician we know of to treat the verb is as a syncagogrammatic term.
Yes, the verb is. Seems so simple, right?
Yeah.
But Sherwood, he saw that it's actually more complicated than it appears. He argued that isn't just a regular verb with one meaning.
Okay.
He said it's equivocal, which means it has multiple meanings, multiple senses, and those different senses can change the truth of a statement.
Give me an example.
Sure. So take the statement, every human is an animal. Seems straightforward, right?
Yeah.
But Sherwood would say, well, it depends on what you mean by is. He identified two main senses of ease. One is esse actuale, which is like actual being, existence in the present.
Okay.
And the other is esse habituale, which is, it's been interpreted in a couple of ways, like relational or conditional.
So how does that change the meaning of every human is an animal?
Well, if you're using esse actuale, then the statement is saying that right now, at this moment, every human is an animal. And that would be false if there weren't any humans alive right now.
Right.
But if you're using esse habituale, then it's more like a conditional statement. It's saying if something is a human, then it is an animal. And that statement would be true even if there were no humans alive right now.
So it's like he's making a distinction between like existence in the present and some kind of potential existence or like a relationship between concepts that holds true regardless of whether there are actual instances of those concepts.
Exactly. He's really getting into some deep stuff here about the relationship between language, existence, and the way we think about categories.
And this is all coming from his analysis of the seemingly simple verb is.
Precisely. And this line of thinking, it led him to embrace the idea of possibilia.
What are those?
Possibilia are things that could exist, but they don't actually exist in the present.
Okay.
And Sherwood said that these possibilia, they have what he called a diminished sort of being, esse diminitum.
So they're not like fully real, but they're not nothing either.
Yeah, it's like they have this potential for existence, this possibility of being.
Interesting. Was this a common view at the time?
Not really. It was pretty unusual, actually. And later on, thinkers like Occam, they weren't too fond of it. But it shows how Sherwood was willing to like really push the boundaries of what was considered philosophically acceptable, all because of his careful analysis of that little word is.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground with Sherwood's semantics. Let's move on to another important part of logic, categorical statements and syllogisms.
Okay, those are the classic building blocks of Aristotelian logic.
Right. So what did Sherwood have to say about them?
Well, he made this really interesting distinction between singular statements and both universal and particular statements.
Okay. Remind me, what's the difference again?
So a singular statement is about a specific individual, like Socrates is running.
Okay.
A universal statement is about an entire category, like all humans are mortal.
Right.
And a particular statement is about some members of a category, like some humans are philosophers.
Gotcha. So what did Sherwood say about singular statements?
He argued that two singular statements that differ only in quality, they're contradictories.
Contradictories?
Yeah, meaning they can't both be true and they can't both be false.
Oh.
So, like Socrates is running and Socrates is not running. Those are contradictories. Only one of them can be true.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, this might seem obvious, but it's important because it shows how Sherwood was carefully thinking about how different types of statements relate to each other, logically speaking.
Right. And what about universal and particular statements?
Well, those had already been, mapped out in the traditional square of opposition. But Sherwood, he went a step further and integrated singular statements into this, creating what's been called a hexagon of opposition.
A hexagon. So he's adding more complexity to the system.
He is. He's showing how singular statements fit into the broader picture of logical relations between statements.
That's cool. It's a shame that we don't have any diagrams of his hexagon of opposition.
Yeah, it would be great to see how he visualized it.
Right. But even without the diagrams, we can still appreciate the thought that went into it.
Absolutely. Now, Sherwood is also famous for something else that's, it's pretty familiar to anyone who's studied logic. Yeah. The syllogism mnemonic verse.
Oh, you mean the Berbera, Celerant, and all that?
That's the one.
I remember having to memorize that in my logic class.
Yeah, generations of logic students have had to wrestle with it. And the earliest version we have of that mnemonic verse, it actually comes from Sherwood.
Really? So he might have invented it.
It's possible.
That's pretty amazing. So for our listeners who might not be familiar with this this mnemonic verse. Can you break it down for us?
Okay, so there are actually two parts to it.
Okay.
The first part is sub pre prima bis pre secunda tertia bis sub.
Okay.
And this tells you the figures of the syllogism. A syllogism is like a three-part logical argument with two premises and a conclusion.
Right.
And the figure refers to like the arrangement of the terms in the premises.
Gotcha. So that first part of the mnemonic, it helps you remember the different figures.
Exactly. Now, the second part of the mnemonic is the really famous one. Barbara, Celerant, Dari, Firio, Berolipton, Salantes Dabitis, Fapesmo, Frisomorum, Cesar, Camestres, Festino, Borapti, Velaptin, Desamas, Detisi, Bocardo, Ferrison.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
That's a lot to memorize.
It is, but it's incredibly clever. Each of those weird words, it represents a valid mood of the syllogism. And the vowels in the words, they tell you the type of propositions in the syllogism.
Okay, how does that work?
So A stands for a universal affirmative proposition, like all S or P.
Right.
E is a universal negative, like no S or P. I is a particular affirmative, like some S or P. And O is a particular negative, like some S or not P.
Wow, that's really efficient. And what about the consonants?
The consonants, they give you clues about how to reduce imperfect moods to the perfect moods of the first figure.
Reduce.
Yeah, so in Aristotelian logic, the first figure is considered the most basic, the most self-evident.
Okay.
And the other figures, well, they can be reduced to the first figure through various logical operations, like converting propositions or switching the order of the premises.
Gotcha.
And the consonants in the mnemonic, they tell you which operation to use. Like S means simple conversion, P means conversion by limitation, M means transposition of premises, and B and R mean reduction per impossible.
So this mnemonic verse, it's like a cheat sheet for doing syllogistic logic.
It is. It's a really powerful tool for understanding and remembering the valid forms of syllogisms.
And Sherwood gave us the earliest known version of it.
Yep. Although, to be fair, his explanation of some of the consonants, it wasn't exactly the same as what later logicians went with.
Oh, how so?
Well, he didn't explicitly connect the first consonants of the mood names to the basic first-figure syllogisms like later commentators did.
Mm-hmm.
And his explanation of B and R was also a bit different. But still, his version of the mnemonic is a major milestone in the history of logic.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to another topic that Sherwood tackled. Modality.
Modality.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big one in philosophy. It's all about necessity, possibility, contingency.
Right. So how did Sherwood approach modality?
Well, he started by giving two definitions of mode. One is broad and one is more specific. In the broad sense, a mode is just the determination of an act. So that could be anything like an adverb like swiftly or loudly. But in the stricter sense, and this is the one that's relevant for his discussion of modal propositions, a mode determines the inherence of the predicate in the subject. Like if you say Socrates is necessarily running, not necessarily there, that's a mode. It's telling you something about how the predicate running inheres in the subject Socrates.
Okay, I see. So not all adverbs are modes in this strict sense.
Right. Only the ones that modify the connection between the subject and the predicate, those are the ones that create modal propositions.
And he identified 6 modes.
Hmm.
True, false, possible, contingent, impossible, and necessary.
Yeah. Although he said true and false, they're not really modes in the same way as the others.
Okay.
His focus was mainly on possible, contingent, impossible, and necessary.
So how did he understand those 4 modes?
Well, what's really interesting about Sherwood's approach is that he had this adverbial view of modality.
What does that mean?
It means he didn't like nominal interpretations of modal statements like, that Socrates is running is necessary. He preferred constructions like Socrates is necessarily running, where the mode is expressed as an adverb modifying the verb.
So it's about how the mode is grammatically expressed.
Yeah, and I think it reflects a deeper philosophical point about how he understood modality. He wasn't thinking of modality as a property of propositions, like, whole statements. He was thinking of as a way of modifying the connection between the subject and the predicate.
That's interesting.
And this view, it contrasts with a lot of modern approaches to modality, which tend to treat modal operators as applying to propositions as a whole.
So he was ahead of his time in some ways and behind in others.
Yeah, you could say that. Now, he also made this interesting distinction between 2 senses of both impossible and necessary.
Okay.
He said there's impossible per se and impossible per accidents.
What's the difference?
Impossible per se is something that cannot be true at any time, whether it's now, in the past, or in the future, like a square circle. But impossible per accidents is something that cannot be true now or in the future, but it might have been true in the past. So it's like it's impossible now, but it wasn't always impossible.
I see.
And he made a similar distinction with necessary. Necessary per se is something that cannot be false at any time, and necessary per accidents is something that cannot be false now or in the future, but it might have been false in the past.
Okay, so he's bringing time into the picture, adding a temporal dimension to his understanding of modality.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's pretty unique. It shows how Sherwood was really thinking about how modal concepts relate to our experience of time and change.
Okay, so he had all these interesting ideas about modality, but the source says that he never actually applied them to syllogisms, even though he said he was going to.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mystery. He specifically said that his discussion of modality was relevant to the study of syllogisms because, modal differences can affect whether a syllogism is valid or not.